Part 1. The Silent Blueprints. The office of Evans Architects was a cathedral of noise. Phones rang with the shrill insistence of commerce. Keyboards clicked in a relentless staccato, and the confident booming voices of ambitious young architects echoed off the polished concrete floors. It was the sound of success, a chaotic symphony conducted by its legendary founder, Arthur Evans. And in a quiet, light-drenched corner of this cathedral, Clara Evans worked in complete and profound silence. For Clara, who had been deaf since a fever took her hearing at the age of 5, the world was a purely visual and tactile experience. The office chatter was just a faint, low vibration she felt through the soles of her feet. This silence wasn't a void. It was a canvas. It allowed her to see the world with a clarity that her hearing colleagues could never comprehend. She didn't just see buildings. She saw the light that filled them, the shadows that defined them, and the quiet, invisible geometry that gave them a soul. At 29, she was her father's greatest and most guarded secret. Her official title was Junior Designer, a role that vastly understated the truth. She was the visionary. At this moment, her entire focus was on a large, intricate model, taking up most of her desk. It was the firm's submission for the new Chicago Central Library competition. While others used computer renders, Clara built with her hands. She felt the texture of the basewood, the smoothness of the acrylic, imagining how 1,000 hands a day would feel on the final building's brass railings. She ran her fingers along the model's curved walls, sensing how sound, or the lack of it, would flow through the grand reading room. Her cousin, Julian, approached her desk, his movements confident and easy. He was the bridge between Clara's silent world and the noisy one of the firm. He was fluent in American Sign Language and acted as her voice in meetings. "It's looking incredible, Clara," he signed, his handsome face a mask of supportive admiration. "Dad wants to review the final schematics for the atrium. What's your latest thinking on the light diffusion?" Clara's hands came alive, weaving a rapid, passionate story in the air. She explained her concept of using angled, fritted glass panels to capture the morning light and fracture it into soft, shifting patterns on the floor below, creating a cathedral of light that changed throughout the day. She grabbed a pencil and sketched the idea with swift, sure strokes, her vision pure and undiluted, and Julian watched, nodding, his own hands moving in practiced signs of encouragement. "Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. A cathedral of light. I love it. I'll make sure he understands." He took her sketch and her notes and walked away. Later that afternoon, in the main conference room, Clara watched through the glass wall as Julian presented her idea to her father and the senior partners. He didn't use her sketch. He had redrawn it himself. And as he spoke, his hands gesturing with practiced enthusiasm, she saw him use the phrase she had just signed, "A cathedral of light." He presented her vision as his own brilliant insight. It was a small, subtle theft, one of 1,000 she had learned to endure. Weeks later, the day of the announcement arrived. The entire firm was gathered in the main hall, the air thick with tension and ambition. Arthur Evans, a man who wore his fame like a perfectly tailored suit, stepped up to a podium. "Good morning," he boomed, his voice resonating with practiced authority. "As you know, this firm was built on a simple principle, that architecture should not just shelter us, but inspire us. It is with that spirit that we entered the competition for the new Central Library." He paused for dramatic effect. This morning, I received a call from the mayor's office. It is my profound honor to announce that Evans Architects has won. The room erupted in cheers. People hugged, shouted, and applauded. Arthur held up his hands for silence, a magnanimous smile on his face. Behind him, a massive screen lit up with a stunning, photorealistic rendering of the library. It was Clara's design, in all its soaring, light-filled glory. This was a project born from my own vision of what a 21st century library should be, Arthur declared. A vision of a true public sanctuary. I want to thank my incredible team, especially my project manager and nephew Julian, whose brilliant insights into creating a cathedral of light were instrumental in realizing this dream. He motioned for Julian to join him at the podium. They stood side by side, uncle and nephew, the past and future of the firm. The applause was deafening. Clara stood in the back of the crowd, completely invisible. They hadn't just stolen her design. They had stolen her voice, her vision, her very words, and broadcast them to the world as their own. And she hadn't made a sound. Partout, the erased name. The celebration party that night was a loud, glittering affair. Champagne flowed, and the city's architectural elite mingled with politicians and donors, all there to praise Arthur Evans for his genius. The noise of the crowd was a physical pressure against Clara's skin, a constant muddy vibration that left her feeling disoriented and profoundly alone. She watched her father and Julian move through the room, accepting congratulations, retelling the story of their vision, until it became an impenetrable truth. She found Julian near the bar, holding court with a group of young associates. She waited patiently until they dispersed, then tapped him on the arm. He turned, his smile bright but his eyes slightly guarded. "Clara, isn't this incredible? We did it!" She kept her hand steady, her signs precise and clear. "The project credits," she signed. "When they publish the official announcements, I want my name included, as a design architect." She wasn't asking for the lead title, just an acknowledgement. A small foothold in the history of her own creation. Julian's easy smile faltered. He glanced around nervously, then leaned in as if sharing a secret. "Clara, you know how these things are," he signed, his movements becoming more placating. "It's about the brand. Evans Architects. It's a cleaner narrative. Uncle Arthur feels that adding too many individual names just confuses the message. Your contribution is part of the firm's success. That's the important thing. We're a team." He framed the erasure as a practical matter of public relations, a business decision. But Clara saw it for what it was, a door being quietly but firmly locked in her face. He was telling her that her name, her identity, had no value. Disappointment, cold and familiar, settled in her stomach. She gave a small, stiff nod and walked away, leaving him to his champagne and his borrowed glory. But she couldn't let it go. She needed to see it for herself. Later that night, when the party had thinned and only a few stragglers remained, she slipped away to her father's office. The grand corner suite was empty, the door left slightly ajar. On his massive, clean desk, illuminated by the glow of the city lights outside, sat a heavy, leather-bound binder. It was the final submission portfolio for the library competition. It must have been left there by mistake. Her heart pounding, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a monument to her father's ego. Awards on the walls, photos of him with mayors and celebrities. She walked to the desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the binder. The first section contained glossy renderings of her design. The next held pages of technical specifications she had calculated. She flipped through the pages, her creation laid out in black and white. Finally, she reached the last page. Project team and credits. Her eyes scanned the list of names. Lead design architect, Arthur Evans. Project manager, Julian Evans. Senior associates, a list of 3 names. Junior draftsmen, a list of 5 more. She read the list again. And a third time. It wasn't there. Her name was nowhere. She wasn't a lead, not an associate, not even a junior draftsman. She had been completely, surgically, and intentionally removed from her own story. She stood there for a long time in the silent, empty office, the binder open before her. The city lights blurred through the unshed tears in her eyes. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a business decision. It was a theft, absolute and profound. She closed the binder with a soft, final thud. The sound was inaudible, but in her world, it was as loud as a slamming prison door. Part 3, the wordless exit. The next morning, Clara arrived at the office before the sun had fully risen, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of gray and rose. The building was quiet, the air still. The frantic energy of the previous day had not yet awoken. She felt a strange sense of calm, the cold, clear calm that follows a devastating storm. There was no anger left, no tears. There was only a quiet, unbending resolve, bending. She went to her workspace, the corner that had been her world for the past 5 years. Methodically, she began to pack. She did not throw things into a box. She curated her departure. She carefully wrapped her specialized drafting tools in a canvas roll. She stacked her beloved books on architectural theory, titles on light, space, and form. She gathered the small personal models she had made for herself over the years, a spiraling staircase, a cantilevered pavilion. They were the children of her imagination, and she would not leave them behind. As she worked, Julian arrived, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stopped short when he saw her packed boxes. "Clara, what's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with a concern that rang completely false. He switched to sign language. "Are you moving desks?" Clara paused her packing and looked at him. She didn't sign a single word. Her silence, her complete refusal to engage, was a wall he could not breach. It unnerved him. His own hands, usually so glib and expressive, hung uselessly at his sides. She finished packing her last box and taped it shut. Then, she turned to her clean, empty desk. She took out a single pristine sheet of heavy, cream-colored architectural paper. From her tool roll, she selected a scalpel with a fresh blade and a steel ruler. With the intense focus of a surgeon, she began to cut and fold the paper. It was not the hangry, impulsive act of tearing something up. It was an act of deliberate, painstaking creation. She made precise incisions, scored exact folding lines, her fingers moving with a dancer's grace. It was an act of origami, but with the unyielding precision of an architect. Slowly, an object began to take shape under her hands. A series of vaulted arches, a sweeping roofline, the intricate latticework of the grand atrium windows. It was a perfect, miniature ghost of the Central Library. Her library. When she was finished, she held it in the palm of her hand. It was beautiful, intricate, and so fragile it seemed a single breath could destroy it. It was everything she had poured into the project, distilled into one small, eloquent object. She picked up her boxes and walked past a stunned and speechless Julian. She didn't look at him. She walked through the quiet office, her steps even and measured. She did not go to her father's office to confront him. The time for that was over. Instead, she walked to the grand conference room, where the large celebratory rendering of her library design was still displayed on an easel. She walked up to the easel and gently placed the small white paper model at its base. The fragile, three-dimensional truth against the large, two-dimensional lie. It was her resignation, her accusation, her final word. Then she turned and walked out of Evans Architects for the last time. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. Her silent, elegant gesture of defiance would be waiting for her father and her cousin, and it would scream louder than any word she could have ever spoken. Part 4. Learning from stillness, Clara did not run to another American city. She ran towards silence. She took the money she had saved, money earned from the firm that had betrayed her, and bought a one-way ticket to Kyoto. If Chicago was a symphony of noise, Kyoto was a study in stillness. Here, silence wasn't an absence of sound. It was a deliberate element of design, as important as wood or stone. She spent her days walking, not as a tourist, but as a pilgrim. She would sit for hours in the Zen garden of Ryoanji, not trying to decipher the meaning of the 15 stones, but studying the vast, powerful emptiness of the raked white gravel between them. She began to understand the Japanese concept of ma, the idea that the negative space, the interval, was what gave shape and meaning to the form itself. She sketched constantly, filling notebooks not with buildings, but with feelings. She drew the way light filtered through the paper of a shoji screen, creating a soft, ethereal glow. She drew the pattern of moss on an ancient stone lantern, a testament to the beauty of imperfection and time. Wabi-sabi. She visited old temples and learned how the architects used natural materials to absorb sound, how the layout of a room could guide a person's breathing into a slower, more meditative rhythm. In the quiet solitude of Kyoto, surrounded by a language she could not hear and a culture that revered the very thing she inhabited, Clara began to heal. The silence that had once been the symbol of her isolation in a hearing world transformed into her sanctuary, her laboratory, and her area of unparalleled expertise. She realized her deafness was not a lack. It was a different way of seeing, a filter that stripped away the auditory chaos and allowed her to perceive the world on a deeper, more structural level. She didn't just see a room. She felt its vibrations, saw its light, understood its soul. Her journey culminated one misty morning at a small overlooked temple on the outskirts of the city. She was watching a shishiodoshi, a bamboo water fountain, as it slowly filled with water, tipped over with a soft clack, and then rose again to repeat the cycle. The sound was minimal, but its rhythm created the silence around it. In that moment, she had a profound realization. Her father's architecture was about making a statement, about being seen and heard. It was loud. Her entire life, she had been trying to learn his language. But that was a mistake. Her purpose as an architect was not to fill space or to shout for attention. It was to do the opposite. It was to craft stillness, to design spaces that allowed people to hear themselves think, to feel a sense of peace in a noisy world. That was her gift. That was her path. After months of wandering, Clara Evans finally knew who she was. Part fils de one-woman studio, Clara returned to the United States a different person. The fragile, wounded girl was gone, replaced by a woman with a quiet, centered strength. She did not return to the architectural battlefield of Chicago. Instead, she chose Portland, Oregon, a city known for its appreciation of craft, nature, and thoughtful design. It was far enough away to be a new beginning. Her first studio was not a grand office space. It was a small rented room above a bookstore with a single large window that overlooked the rain-slicked streets. The space was minimalist. A large drafting table, a bookshelf filled with her texts from Japan, and a single, perfect orchid on the windowsill. There was no Evans on the door. There was no sign at all. She was starting from zero. She knew she couldn't compete with the big firms for lucrative public contracts, so she didn't try. She sought out the small, forgotten projects, the ones that required more soul than budget. Her first commission came from a yoga studio. They wanted to convert a cramped storage closet into a meditation room. While other architects would have seen it as a thankless job, Clara saw it as a perfect challenge. She lined the walls with untreated cedar, which absorbed sound and gave off a calming scent. She designed a single narrow skylight that would track a sliver of light across the floor throughout the day, acting as a natural silent clock. She created a space that felt sacred and expansive, despite being no bigger than a walk-in closet. The studio owner was speechless. Her next client was a reclusive, wealthy author who wanted a private library built as an extension to his modernist home. He was a man who valued silence above all else. Clara spent a week just observing him and his land. She designed a room with non-parallel walls to prevent sound reverberation. The towering bookshelves were designed with built-in acoustic, baffling, turning the books themselves into sound-absorbing panels. She designed a single, large picture window that didn't look out onto a grand vista, but was perfectly framed to view a single, ancient Japanese maple tree in his garden. It was a room designed for one person, one tree, and the universe of thought contained in the books. The author, a man of few words, gave her the highest possible praise. "I have never been able to hear my own thoughts so clearly," he wrote to her in a note. She didn't advertise. She didn't need to. Her clients became her disciples. Word began to spread through a niche community of artists, writers, and patrons who were looking for more than just a building. They were looking for a sanctuary. They spoke of a mysterious, quiet architect who didn't just design rooms, but designed feelings. Her name was never mentioned, but her work began to develop a cult following, a quiet resonance that was slowly building in strength. Part 6. A quiet resonance. The whispers about the silent architect eventually reached the ears of Alistair Finch, a senior writer for Venue, an influential and impeccably curated magazine dedicated to high-end architectural design. Finch was a man weary of the loud, ego-driven starchitecture that dominated the covers of most publications. The rumors of an anonymous designer creating impossibly serene spaces intrigued him. After some careful inquiries, he tracked down the reclusive author whose library Clara had designed. The author, initially hesitant, was so reverent of the space Clara had created that he agreed to let Finch's team photograph it, on one condition: the architect's identity must remain completely anonymous. The resulting feature was the cover story for Venue's spring issue. It was a stunning photo essay. The pictures were beautiful, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, wood and glass. But it was Finch's writing that made the story resonate. The article was titled, "The Soul of Space. Can a room be a form of meditation?" Finch wrote. "In an age where buildings scream for our attention, with jagged angles and self-important facades, I have just visited a room that does the opposite. It whispers. This small private library, designed by an architect who insists on anonymity, is a masterpiece of tranquility. The silence here is not empty. It is a tangible presence, a physical element of the design. The light does not merely illuminate, it paints the passage of time on the walls. One does not simply sit in this room. One communes with it. This is not architecture for the ego. This is architecture for the soul." The article caused a sensation in the design world. It was a quiet counter-revolution against the noise of modern architecture. The feature was shared thousands of times online. The question on everyone's lips was, who is this architect? In Chicago, in the bustling, noisy office of Evans Architects, Julian placed a copy of the magazine on his uncle's desk. Arthur Evans studied the photographs, a flicker of professional jealousy in his eyes. He recognized the profound skill, the depth of thought. It had the same spark of genius he had seen and stolen from his own daughter. "It's elegant," he said dismissively, closing the magazine. "But it's a gimmick, a one-hit wonder. This architect will never be able to handle a major public works project. It's a completely different league." Far away in her small Portland studio, Clara saw the article on her laptop screen. She saw her work, her philosophy, her very soul, being celebrated on a national stage. For a moment, she felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy, and then her eyes drifted to a small news banner at the bottom of the same webpage. It was a press release from the city of Chicago. Her heart stopped. "City announces international design competition for new public landmark, the Sanctuary of Silence." She stared at the screen, at the two headlines side by side. The article celebrating her anonymous triumph, and the announcement of a competition that seemed to be calling her, and her alone, back home to face her past. The quiet resonance of her new life was about to collide with the deafening silence of her old one. Part 7. The competition of the decade. The announcement landed like a seismic event in the architectural world. The city of Chicago, in partnership with a massive philanthropic arts foundation, officially launched an international competition for a new public landmark to be built in a prime location within Millennium Park. The project was not a museum, not a theater, but something far more ambitious and abstract, the Sanctuary of Silence. The design brief was a challenge that bordered on poetry. It called for a secular public space dedicated to quiet contemplation, a refuge from the unyielding sonic assault of modern urban life. It needed to be a world-class architectural statement, a new icon for the city's skyline. But its purpose was internal. Its goal was peace. With a 9-figure budget and a jury comprised of Pritzker Prize-winning architects and renowned urban theorists, it was immediately hailed as the most important architectural competition in North America for a decade. At the gleaming offices of Evans Architects, the news was received with a sense of supreme, unshakable confidence. For Arthur Evans, this was destiny. His firm had built the adjacent library. They were the logical, inevitable choice to build its spiritual counterpart. This would be the final, magnificent jewel in the crown of his legacy. "This isn't a competition," he declared to his senior partners in a firm-wide meeting. "It's a coronation. No one understands the architectural language of this city better than we do." He assigned Julian to lead the project team. Julian, still riding the wave of acclaim from the library, embraced the task with vigor. He saw this as his chance to finally step out of his uncle's shadow and prove he was a visionary in his own right. He and his team immediately began brainstorming. Their concepts were grand, expensive, and loud in their own way. They envisioned massive soundproofed walls of marble, a dramatic soaring atrium, and a state-of-the-art water feature engineered by German sound artists. Their design was a monument to silence, a loud declaration of quiet. It was about overpowering the noise of the city through force and technology. They were designing what they thought silence should look like. Meanwhile, in her small Portland studio, Clara read the design brief over and over again. The words seemed to lift off the page and speak directly to her. A refuge from sonic assault. A space for contemplation. This wasn't just a project. It was the physical manifestation of her entire philosophy. The culmination of her journey from Kyoto to the present moment. The thought of competing against her family, of willingly stepping back into their orbit, was terrifying. It felt like reopening a wound that had only just begun to scar over. She spent a week in a state of conflicted paralysis. She would open the competition files on her computer, then close them again. One evening, her friend and landlord, the owner of the bookstore downstairs, came up to her studio with a pot of tea. She was an older woman named Lena, a different Lena, who had a quiet, observant wisdom. "You've been wrestling with that announcement for days," Lena said, pouring the tea. "What are you afraid of?" "I'm afraid of them," Clara admitted, her hands shaping the words in the air. "My father, my cousin, it's their city, their territory." Lena looked at the beautiful, intricate model of the author's library sitting on a nearby shelf. "They live in the city where it's being built," she said gently. "But this project, this sanctuary, it wasn't made for them. It was made for you. You don't have to go back there to fight them. You just have to go show them who you are." Her friend's words cut through the fear. She was right. This wasn't about them. It was about the work. It was about proving on the world's biggest stage that her unique perception of the world was not a weakness, but a profound strength. That night, she downloaded the official entry packet and registered under a newly created, anonymous name. Stillwater Design Studio. The decision was made. The architect of silence was going to make some noise. Part 8. A Design from the Heart. For the next 2 months, Clara lived and breathed the sanctuary of silence. Her small studio became a cocoon of creativity, the walls slowly being covered in sketches, material samples, and light diffusion diagrams. She worked with a singular, ferocious focus, fueled by a sense of purpose she had never felt before. This was more than a competition entry. It was her manifesto. Her process was unlike that of any other firm. She began not with a grand shape, but with a feeling. She would sit in her silent studio, close her eyes, and imagine walking from the noisy chaos of Michigan Avenue into a space of absolute peace. What would that journey feel like? Her design was born from that question. It was not a towering monument. It was a gentle descent. The entrance was a long, gradually sloping ramp that led visitors below ground level, the walls made of a porous, sound-absorbing limestone. With every step, the sharp sounds of the city, the traffic, the sirens, the chatter, would soften, replaced by the gentle sound of one's own footsteps on the stone. The journey into the building was the beginning of the meditation. The main chamber was a large circular space, but its genius was in its subtlety. The walls were not flat. They were gently curved and lined with panels of soft, felted wool and dark, rich walnut, materials chosen for their ability to stop sound from bouncing. The floor was not solid concrete. It was a floating floor, built on a hidden layer of rubber insulation that absorbed the low-frequency vibrations from the subway tunnels that ran deep beneath the park. Clara was designing a space where one would feel no vibrations from the outside world, a concept only someone hyper-aware of such things could have conceived. Light was the main architectural feature. Instead of a massive skylight, she designed a single, large oculus in the center of the ceiling, open to the sky. Directly below it was a shallow, black granite basin, filled with a still, paper-thin layer of water. The oculus would project a perfect circle of light onto the water's surface. As the day progressed, this circle of light would move slowly across the dark stone, a silent, celestial clock marking the passage of time. There were no other decorations. The art was the interplay of light, water, and shadow. She built the model by hand, her fingers tracing every curve and angle. It was a stunning object, minimalist and profound. It didn't look like a building that was fighting the city. It looked like a piece of the earth that was offering refuge from it. When it was all finished, the blueprints, the technical specifications, the material lists, and the beautiful handcrafted model, she packed it all into a series of professional, anonymous, black portfolio cases. The rules of the competition's first round were strict. All submissions were to be delivered by courier and judged completely blind, identified only by registration number. She drove the boxes to the shipping center herself. As she slid the package across the counter, a simple act that felt momentous, she knew she had poured every ounce of her pain, her healing, and her unique vision into this design. It was the truest thing she had ever created. Now, it was up to the world to listen. Part 9. Two Titans. The jury deliberation was a closed-door affair held in a high-rise overlooking the park where the sanctuary would one day stand. The 5 jurors, a legendary Japanese architect, a Pulitzer-winning architecture critic, a Brazilian landscape designer, a Chicago philanthropist, and a Finnish acoustic engineer, were faced with over 200 submissions from the most famous firms on the planet. For 2 days, they waded through a sea of predictable designs. Most were variations on a theme. Massive, imposing structures that screamed silence with all the subtlety of a bullhorn. They were impressive, expensive, and soulless. The jury grew weary. Then they came to the submission from Evans Architects. The jurors acknowledged its quality. The renderings were spectacular. The materials were luxurious. "It's a very dramatic theatrical space," the critic noted. "A grand gesture. But," she added, tapping her pen on the table, "does it feel peaceful? Or does it just feel like a very expensive, very quiet bank lobby?" The Finnish acoustic engineer agreed. "Technically, their soundproofing is state-of-the-art, but it's a brute force approach. It's about isolation. It feels cold. The debate was lukewarm. It was a competent, powerful entry. A safe choice. Then they opened the submission from Stillwater Design Studio. A hush fell over the room as they studied the blueprints and the photos of the simple, elegant model. They read the design philosophy, which spoke of felt vibrations and the architecture of breath. "My God," the Japanese architect said softly, tracing the line of the entrance ramp with his finger. "This is not about blocking sound. This is about choreographing a journey away from it." "Look at this," the acoustic engineer said, pointing to the floating floor design. "This is brilliant. This architect isn't just thinking about airborne sound. They're thinking about somatic felt vibrations. This is a level of understanding that is simply profound." The critic chimed in, her voice full of excitement. "The other designs are about what you don't hear. This one is about what you do feel. Stillness, the passage of time, your own presence in the space. This isn't a building, it's a poem." The debate was no longer lukewarm. It was passionate. The jury was unanimous. The 200 submissions had been culled to 2. The public announcement was made a week later at a press conference at the Chicago Cultural Center. The head of the jury, the venerable Japanese architect, stood at the podium. "After a rigorous review process, the jury has selected 2 finalists for the Sanctuary of Silence competition," he announced. "The first finalist is the esteemed and powerful firm whose work has already done so much to shape our city's landscape, Evans Architects." A polite, expected round of applause. Arthur and Julian, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride. "The second finalist," the architect continued, a slight intrigued smile on his face, "is a firm we had never heard of before this competition. A firm whose submission showed a depth of thought that left the entire jury in awe. Stillwater Design Studio." A wave of murmurs and whispers rippled through the room. "Who? Stillwater?" The media went into a frenzy, reporters frantically typing the name into their phones, finding nothing. In their office, Arthur and Julian stared in disbelief, their victory lap turning into an infuriating dead heat against a complete unknown. In her Portland studio, Clara watched the live stream of the press conference. She saw her anonymous name announced as an equal to the titan that was her father's firm. The first battle, the battle of ideas, had been won. A slow, determined smile spread across her face. The showdown was set. Part 10, the twist, the acoustic flow. In the final weeks leading up to the presentation, Clara wasn't just refining her own design. She was dissecting her opponents. To build the most compelling argument for her sanctuary, she needed to understand every aspect of her family's work, especially their most celebrated project, the Central Library. She put in a public records request and obtained the complete set of as-built technical drawings, the final official blueprints of the library as it was constructed. She pinned the massive sheets to the wall of her studio, studying them for hours. It was a painful exercise, like looking at a photograph of a loved one who had betrayed you. Everything was there: her sweeping atrium, her terraced reading nooks, her unique, light-capturing facade. And then she saw it. It was a detail buried deep in the cross-sections of the main reading room, a detail only she would ever think to look for. Her original design had specified a complex, custom-designed acoustic baffling system to be installed behind the grand wooden wall panels. It was a multi-layered system, using materials of varying densities, designed to absorb a wide spectrum of sound frequencies, from the high-pitched whisper of a turning page to, most critically, the deep, low-frequency vibrations that emanate from the subway tunnels running deep beneath downtown Chicago. But on the as-built drawings, her intricate system was gone. In its place was a standard, single-density, off-the-shelf acoustic panel. Clara stared at the drawing, a cold understanding dawning on her. She knew exactly what had happened. Her father and Julian, in their arrogance, would have seen her complex design as over-engineered, an unnecessary expense. They couldn't hear the low-frequency vibrations, so to them the problem didn't exist. They had simplified her work, cut a corner to save time and money, completely ignorant of the core purpose behind her original, more complex specification. They had built a library that was audibly quiet to a hearing person, but to someone like Clara, who perceived the world through vibration, they had built a drum. The constant subliminal hum from the trains below would be a persistent, jarring noise that undermined the very tranquility the room was meant to provide. The library, their greatest triumph, was flawed, and its flaw was born directly from their inability to comprehend her unique, deaf-centric perspective. They had stolen her design, but had failed to steal her understanding. This was her weapon. It was more powerful than any accusation. It was proof, irrefutable, technical proof, that they were leading a church whose scripture they had never truly read. She carefully scanned the flawed blueprint, saved it to a data file, and integrated it into her presentation. It was no longer just a presentation about her own design. It was now also a case study on the critical difference between the illusion of silence and the architecture of true stillness. Parte doble, the final presentation. The day of the final presentation was held in the Pritzker Pavilion, a landmark of architectural innovation in itself. The atmosphere was electric. The auditorium was filled with the city's most powerful figures, the media, and the entire jury, their faces impassive and serious. Evans' architects presented first. Arthur and Julian took the stage, a slick, confident duo. Their presentation was a spectacle of high-tech renderings and corporate buzzwords. They showcased their design for the sanctuary, a massive, white marble cube, stark and imposing, with a vast, echoing central hall. They spoke of monumentality, iconic form, and luxurious serenity. They were selling an image, a postcard of silence. It was impressive, expensive, and deeply impersonal. When they finished, there was a polite, respectful applause. Then, the jury chair, the venerable Japanese architect Kaito Tanaka, stepped to the microphone. And now we will hear from our second finalist, Stillwater Design Studio. The heavy side door of the stage opened. A single figure walked out, followed by another. It was Clara, dressed in a simple, elegant charcoal grey suit, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. Behind her was a professional sign language interpreter. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the auditorium. This was Stillwater. This young woman. Clara took her place at the podium, and the main camera feed projected her image onto the massive screens on either side of the stage. In the front row, Julian's jaw went slack. Arthur Evans stared, his face turning ashen, his mind refusing to process the impossible sight before him. The ghost they had erased, the silent girl they had left behind, had returned, and she was standing on the biggest stage in their world, positioned as their equal. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Clara met her father's horrified gaze for a brief second, her own expression unreadable. Then she turned her attention to the jury, took a deep breath, and began to sign. Part 12. The Architecture of Truth. Clara's presentation was everything her family's was not. It was quiet, personal, and profound. Through her interpreter, whose voice was calm and clear, she didn't just describe a building, she articulated a philosophy. True silence is not the absence of sound, she began, her hands moving with fluid, articulate grace. It is the presence of peace. My design for the sanctuary does not seek to build walls against the city. It seeks to offer a gentle journey away from it. She walked the jury and the audience through her design. She explained how the sloping entrance ramp was designed to match the rhythm of a slowing heartbeat. She described how the porous stone walls would absorb the city's vibrations, calming the bones of the building itself. She spoke of the oculus and the moving circle of light, not as a feature, but as a sundial for the soul. She captivated the room, not with dramatic renderings, but with the sheer, undeniable intelligence and empathy of her vision. When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence, the kind she had designed her building to create. The jury was visibly moved. During the question and answer period, the Finnish acoustic engineer leaned into his microphone. An extraordinary presentation. I have a technical question. Your design places an unprecedented emphasis on mitigating low-frequency somatic vibration. Can you elaborate on why this is so critical, when traditional airborne sound is the usual focus for a space like this? It was the question she had been waiting for. The perfect opening. That is an excellent question, she signed, her expression thoughtful. It's because the absence of what we can hear is not the same as true silence. True silence must also be felt. It is the absence of unwanted vibration. A failure to understand this critical distinction can lead to flaws, even in our most celebrated public spaces. With a click of her remote, a new image appeared on the large screens. It was the technical cross-section of the Central Library's reading room. For example, she continued, let's look at the acoustic baffling system in the nearby Central Library. A red circle appeared on the diagram, highlighting the simplified single-density panel her family had used. The specification here was for a standard sound absorption panel, designed to mitigate airborne noise, and it does that well. However, it does nothing to stop the constant, low-frequency vibrations from the subway tunnels below. This creates a subliminal hum, a physical noise that prevents the space from ever achieving true tranquility. She then clicked the remote again, showing a diagram of her original multi-layered design. The original design for this space called for a floating floor and a multi-density baffling system to prevent this very issue. It would have created a truly silent space. A crucial detail, she concluded, looking out at the stunned faces of the jury. It seems was lost in translation. She didn't have to say another word. The implication was a thunderclap in the silent room. She had just, with the cool precision of a surgeon, exposed the fatal flaw in her family's greatest work, and simultaneously proven her authorship of it. She hadn't just understood the problem. She had designed the solution years ago. Arthur Evans looked like he had been turned to stone. Julian stared at the floor, utterly defeated. The jury's deliberation was a formality. The winner was announced an hour later. It was a unanimous landslide victory for Stillwater Design Studio. Clara accepted the commission, her interpreter's voice shaking slightly with emotion as she translated Clara's words of gratitude. She did not look at her family. They were no longer relevant. Months later, Clara stood on the empty construction site in Millennium Park. The city hummed around her, a familiar vibration under her feet. But it was no longer a chaotic noise. It was a baseline, a starting point from which she would build. She was not just building a sanctuary for the city. She was building one for herself, a legacy of profound and powerful silence built on the ashes of their noise.